But then I guess in 2007, I think you were deployed at that time?
2009. And
2009.
Yeah.
Okay, so 2007, FDA had the biggest recall ever, and that was melamine in pet
Oh,
food.
the melamine. Oh, please. I was in private practice. Oh my gosh. Yeah, that was like watching everything just like it was a catastrophe.
Right.
AVMA was so good. We were getting emails like maybe even twice a day, adding more foods from the pet food channels of different pet foods that were coming up with melamine in it. Oh my God. So what was your involvement, or how did that flare on your radar?
So I hadn't really heard about it, and my office director came in and sat down, and it was like March 15th or the Ides of March. Anyway, she said, "Is there any way you can help the folks in Rockville?" And I said, "How? What are you talking about?" And she said, "Well, all these dogs and cats are dying." And I said, "Oh." And then she told me that they had this problem. And I said, and that they were dying of kidney failure. And she said, "You know about kidneys?" I said, "Yeah, I know about kidneys. I've got a PhD in pathology, and, I studied kidneys. And when I was studying my fish kidneys, I had to know everything about human and mammalian kidneys as well. So yeah, I'm really well versed in that." And so at that point, the center didn't have a pathologist working for them. So they sent me all the path reports, and they included me on calls with AVMA, with AAVLD, American Association of Animal Veterinary Laboratory Diagnosticians. So I was beginning to be pulled into what they were seeing. And again, the collaboration, the talking with people was very important. So I said, the vets that were on the call said, "We have not seen these kind of crystals before. We see the crystals in the kidneys of these animals that are dying. We're not seeing enough of them to cause the animal to die. It doesn't make sense."
Right.
And so that at that point, we didn't have the word melamine yet, but I said, "Send me the crystals," or the pictures of the crystals. And then within a couple of days, identified melamine, but melamine's relatively non-toxic. It is about as toxic as table salt. So I basically, I cloistered myself for about 2 weeks. I was just constantly looking up melamine research articles. The crystals, however, when the vets said that they hadn't seen those before, I said, "I have seen something like this." And this is serendipity. When I was at the medical school, we studied gout in humans. And the tophi that you get, when you look at those histologically, uric acid crystals are like needles, very thin needles. And if you put them into tissue sections after fixing with formaldehyde, you see where they were, but they're not there anymore. They dissolve in formaldehyde. And occasionally, these needle-like crystals will form into spheres. And in humans that have undergone chemo, when they have leukemia and they have all these dead cells in their bloodstream, and the nucleic acids start degrading, and you get a purine metabolism problem, they end up with a lot of uric acid in their system, and those crystal out in the kidneys, forming those spherulites that were very characteristic of what people were seeing in the dogs and cats. And those crystals do what in humans is called, they create a uric acid nephropathy. Those spheres get plugged in the plumbing. It's mechanical. They stop all of the tubules from flowing, which makes the kidney swell, which blocks the blood supply and causes renal failure. And my hypothesis was that maybe somehow melamine in combination with the animal's uric acid is forming these kind of crystals, and the vets aren't seeing very many crystals in the kidneys because maybe they dissolve or some of them dissolve. And so the number that isn't causing renal failure is an artifact of dissolution. So that was my hypothesis. And I put it forward, and there was one other thing. There was one article which was a rat 2-year toxicity study of melamine. And again, they survived. They were looking for cancers. What they found was they made bladder stones that were uric acid and melamine. So I had a rationale for maybe it's a combined thing. I also found an article that had described melamine cyanuric acid as forming very stable sheets, and it was used as a flame retardant because it became a very stable crystalline structure. And the rat article also mentioned when they cut open the kidney, they saw crystals. They said that they saw microcrystals, one sentence in the materials and methods, but they never talked about the histo of them. And so again, I'm thinking, if it's melamine and uric acid that they're seeing in crystalline form grossly, and they plunk it into formalin, they're not going to see it histologically. So I sent this forward, and there was a fair amount of, you know, like, well, I don't know if we really believe this hypothesis, but during that time, on top of the pets getting sick, they found out that some of the scraps from the pet food manufacturer had gone to poultry feed and hog feed. And so 50,000 and more pigs had eaten this material, and over 2.5 million chickens had eaten this stuff.
Oh, I had no idea.
So there's your human food safety component.
Yeah.
And, you know, I had suggested quietly to the center we should try to do some exposure studies where we give melamine plus cyanuric acid to, and cyanuric acid is a triazine, so it's also part of the manufacture of melamine, so it can show up in there. I had suggested that they do some exposure studies, and they were like, we are not doing mammalian studies on this.
So wait, stop, hold it right there. So you knew they went to pigs and chickens that were going to be used for human. Do we know
that had already been used?
That had already been used. Now I'm going to stop.
They did risk assessments. Oh yeah, big time. So CIPSAM was involved with that, Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. That's the human side. So they were all involved too, yes. And NCTR was becoming involved as well. But what happened was, in addition, they, some of the materials and some of the wheat gluten had gone to Canada to an aquaculture food producer. And they used the contaminated ingredients. And then that food was sent back to the United States to an aquaculture facility that had fish that were going to be potentially used for human food. So that landed back in my lap because I do fish, right? So I said, well, if we're not going to expose mammals, maybe we should expose fish. And I told you about the incurred residues that were the collaborations we had with the various groups around the country to give fish illegal drugs that they could do this. All of a sudden, people needed methods for residues for melamine in mammals, but also fish. So we said, work on the methods in fish tissues, and we will provide you with incurred residues. And while we're doing that, we're going to use melamine. And by that point in time, they had also found cyanuric acid in the tissues as well, or in the crystals as well. So cyanuric acid is harder to detect than melamine. And so when they found the cyanuric acid, they looked at my hypothesis again and said, oh, maybe she's onto something. So I said, we want to dose them with melamine alone. We want to dose them with cyanuric acid alone. And we want to dose the fish with both to see if the fish make crystals, because I said, I'm sure that they do the same thing that the mammals do. And sure enough, they did. But the time frame, March 15th was when they came to FDA, Menu Foods came to FDA. I started dosing fish in June. So we're talking 3 months. That is lightning speed to get a study up and running. And the reason I was able to do it was because we already had the IACUC protocol for dosing fish with various chemicals. And all we had to do was just submit an attachment to that and say, we want to use these chemicals now, and the justification for why. And that flew through the IACUC because they realized the urgency.
And so as I recall, the only other exposure that I knew of, excuse me, to humans at that time was through baby formula. And
that was a year later. That was a year later.
Yeah, and that it didn't get through the FDA because the FDA was able to test for it when it came through in baby formula. And so it never affected our infants, but it did affect infants in South America because they didn't. And again, this is all part of something called food fraud.
Yes.
And protein
adulteration.
Counterfeit. Yeah. And it showed up, the melamine showed up as a protein on the very, very light scan, let's call it. Oh, we're scanning for protein. Yeah, it's showing up as protein. And it was really a cheap form of, quotes, protein. It was food fraud.
Exactly.
Now I have to know what the heck happened with the fish that was going to go to human consumption. Does it cause a problem in humans?
Right. So that's a long story further on. And basically, melamine excretes pretty well in the animals. So it goes through their kidneys. If it doesn't if you don't have the combined toxicity, if you don't have melamine cyanuric acid, then melamine just gets peed out and the residues go down very quickly. But I started doing residue studies where we were looking at depletion in fish in 2008. And I had written up the whole article about what we did, all the exposures. We also did pig exposures, and we showed a whole lot of various, the crystals in the cat and the pig and the fish, and they all look the same. We wrote that up, but it was hung up in publication for the longest time. And eventually in September, it got published, and it was the same, like a day before I had been nominated for a SAMI award for the work that I did. So, the Service to America Awards. So I was in Washington, and it was September 11th, 2008. And I saw a headline for the infant formula thing, and that was actually in China. And so like the paper was getting published, and I said, okay, closure, I'll finish up these residue studies and life will be good and I can get back to my fish as opposed to doing the melamine work. And and the infant formula thing hit. I flew with the commissioner. We got a whole group of people together to talk to their pediatricians, and they were finding stones in the kidneys of the infants, and they had tested and found melamine in them. And like one of the pediatricians said, it was like 40 kids in one hospital, babies. In China.
Okay.
And they ended up, they're radiolucent too, so they had to do ultrasound. And they found 300,000 babies with stones in their kidneys with that screening. And it's like, thank God, what they were doing was people were selling protein powder to farmers. The farmers were diluting the milk and adding protein powder to make it better, and then selling it to the distributors. The distributors were diluting the already diluted milk and adding melamine. And then they were selling it to the infant formula manufacturers. Nobody, people will say, oh, they were adding melamine to the infant formula. There's no evidence of that. They did find melamine on farms and at the distributors. But it was, once you dry it all down, the melamine's in there. But luckily, it was the pure stuff. In 2007, they were using scrap melamine, which was the dregs after melamine manufactured, and that had the cyanuric acid in it. If they had used that in the milk, that would have killed all those babies. So thank goodness they used the pure melamine. But like you said, they called it protein powder. They're improving their milk, and in China they sell milk based on protein content, not fat content.
And that's where it's worth more because of the higher protein content. You keep adding this.
But the government here has never allowed import of Chinese infant formula. It is not allowed in the country. So we dodged a bullet there. I mean, it's occasionally people would smuggle it in with their suitcases or whatever, but it's mostly not, it's not available in the United States.
Yeah, yeah.
So that was, I was asked by WHO, World Health Organization, to join a committee, and I went up to Canada and provided background information. We were the only ones doing melamine residue studies at that time, you know, so, and then I came back from that meeting and I said, you know, I know I'm doing it in fish, and I know fish are a great model, and I'm the one that promotes them all the time, but I said, we need to do this in mammals. And so we did pig studies, and
So that's where the pig study came in at that
Yeah,
point, because
yeah,
you had to.
yeah.
Mhm.
And so the story here, the melamine story, really talks about reach out to. When I was reading all these pathology reports, I was also reading, you know, what they said at the consumer complaints. And one vet had submitted a complaint saying, I took half the kidney and I put it in formaldehyde and I submitted it to the pathologist, and the other half I froze. And I said, she froze it, you know, and so
Yes.
one of my theories was, you know, the crystals dissolve. So I contacted her, I shipped her a box of dry ice, she shipped it back to me. I got the box with the kidney on a Friday afternoon, and I did what you do in fish medicine a lot, is where you take just a thin slice and you look at it under a microscope, you just squish it between two
The
slides.
microfilm, I think. Mhm.
And I looked at it, and it's full of crystals.
See, that would, I remember the AVMA said to us, when you ship samples in from any of these dogs, you do cats, you do necropsy, you have to freeze. Ultimately, that came through months and months later, because we were all trained to send in our samples in formaldehyde. Oh my God.
Oh, for tox, you always take a piece of it and you freeze it. For you know, I mean, that's like routine protocol. Tox, you know, a potential tox thing you have to freeze. So she had sent me that, and I dumped formaldehyde all over the one that I had just looked at and taken a picture of. I pulled the one slide off, put formaldehyde on it, left, went home. Monday morning, I come back, all the crystals are gone.
All the crystals are gone when you did that. Wow.
And so that answered that. Now, you know, when you plug a piece of kidney into formaldehyde, you know, there's parts in the middle that don't get as much formaldehyde.
Right. And that's where they saw them. Yes.
Exactly. Exactly.
Thank God.
So, but the reach out to vets, the reach out to AVMA, the reach out to the vet diagnosticians, that helped me figure it out. And, you know, and I mean, other chemists came up with the fact that it was melamine and cyanuric acid, but I understood the mechanism because of this, and I understood the pathology. And so in 2010, you know, I basically went back to my folks at FDA and I said, you know, we really need something where we can actually do stuff with people outside of FDA.
Mhm.
And so in 2010, we ended up with money that was available to start a network of labs to work with FDA, that we would have funding in place, and that we could, you know, ask for help from the vet diagnostic community and use them to do case investigations. And so at that point, I had pretty much done a lot with fish. I had sort of diverted and done about 3 years of melamine research in mammals at that point. I worked with NCTR. They developed a mouse model. We did all of their wet mounts. They would ship us all of it, and we would read all their slides for that. So we got the funding. In the next 10 years, basically, I headed up a new lab, or a new network that was creating something from nothing. So, and that I felt was a very successful and wonderful 10 years of life. We had an organizing meeting. We invited USDA's non-labs. We worked with them. We worked with the FERN, the Food Emergency Response Lab.
Mhm.
We developed funding opportunities. Our first one was before I even had labs. I had to submit to the grants folks a proposal for an RFA before we even had our meeting with potential labs. But by the summer, when, you know, it always takes grants and contracts forever to post an RFA. So it's almost like having a baby. It's 9 months at least in the black hole somewhere. And but that got posted, and we funded 11 labs. And if you know, like, I knew grant applications from the outside. And this time I was doing it from the inside, you know, from the one providing the money. And all 11 labs had, you know, submitted proposals to do whatever the heck they wanted to. And these were collaborative agreement projects. So I said, we are all going to work together. And I divided them up into, you know, I said, all your proposals were nice. Now we're going to melt them into one study. And we had a third of the folks working on harmonizing the methods. So I had, you know, a couple of the key microbiologists figure out a method that everybody would use.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had another group of the PIs working on the questionnaire that they would ask the owners. And the third group was creating a brochure that every school would put their own picture on and their own logo on, and that would be the client education. And the project was looking at salmonella in dog and cat feces, because you get dog food, cat food that has salmonella in it, dry foods even. And, and everybody worries about the people being exposed, sure, but nobody really knows if the animals are having an issue with it. And that hadn't really been looked at. And I said, well, let's find out what the background levels are. Mm-hmm. So we were looking at, you know, animals that came into the clinic, you know, some had diarrhea, some didn't, and we looked at all of them. And in the middle, it was a 2-year project, and in the middle of that, there was an outbreak, and it was the Salmonella Infantis outbreak. And we contacted CDC at that point, and we said, if you got any households that have a pet, whether or not they've got diarrhea, we have 11 labs around the country. We'll work with their vet, we'll fund the shipping, we'll fund the testing, and we will keep testing those animals if they're positive to make sure that there's no positive pets in the household where they've already had sick people. And
this is, as I recall, I believe I was exposed to VetLearn, and tell me the anachronism of the LIRN. What does that stand for?
It's the Veterinary Laboratory Investigation and Response Network.
Mm-hmm. Now, when I believe I was exposed was during my food safety master's program. And now tell me, is this where you are able to backtrack the genotype of the salmonella?
Well, we actually, while we were working on that, and then we wanted to publish it, we actually did sequence them all the ones that we isolated.
And that's why you were able to determine what the initiation of the outbreak was.
Well, I mean, that was pretty clear. You know, mm-hmm. they found the salmonella in the dog food, and they found it in the people. And
yeah, that was the documentation. That was the proof. Yeah. That's incredible. And so,
but at that time, before we were even sequencing, they were using PFGE to, you know, the older technology.
Right. Yeah. So this is very critical. This integration of the veterinary diagnostic labs to be able to provide this. And here it went from the concept of the melamine now we're going to bacteria, mm-hmm. And food safety does end up being a part of that because this is pet food safety.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And so there are 3 main missions to VetLearn. We took the mission for Center for Vet Medicine, which is to promote human and animal health. And we added by collaborating with veterinary diagnostic labs to provide data. And that's our case investigations when there's a problem, and that, you know, pet food problem or large animal food problem. Prepare for emergencies. We did proficiency tests, and also we did interlaboratory comparison exercises, and also professional development. And there is actually in your list of documents that I sent you, there is an article in AVMA about VetLearn, and it's a guide to vets reporting food problems.
Oh, that'll be important. I'll have to make a note to include that as well. So I got to tell you, I'm kind of astonished. As much as I read through everything that you sent me to prepare for this, I have to admit, it does not at all provide to me the level and of the extraordinary level that you had achieved in helping indirectly pet food safety and human food safety issues because of generating these new projects that you built from the ground up. In some cases, actually did that. So just want to stop for a moment and thank you. I mean, I could tell that you're like me, you have a passion and there's an excitement and a curiosity that drives you. But my gosh, I am so thrilled that you were able to bring these ideas into fruition. I dare guess there were a number that you couldn't, because as you were saying, you'd write these grants and they were sending you from one, it was like a ping pong match, right? You're watching that. Exactly. But here you are finally able to accomplish something with the FDA at Center for Veterinary Medicine. So, so this brings us up to around 2010, 11, somewhere in there. So what happened next?
Well, 2010 was when I got the funding for VetLearn. So, you know, I'm trying to think, the Salmonella study that I described was, you know, about a 2-year study, and then we published it a couple of years later. So probably 2012, 2013.
Right, and I'll also put the link for that big situation in CDC. I refer that to people quite often. It was the Salmonella outbreak in dry dog food. People just can't conceive of it in their minds. They just like, okay, you know, wash your hands after you feed your pets or give them treats. Trust me on this, and here's why. So I'll put that link in as well. This is going to be in the show notes. This is going to be a very exciting set of show notes that people could probably be using for some research on their own when they have to write articles.
So what we basically did was we settled down to doing the things that were in the mission. We did case investigations. One case investigation, you might have heard it, it hit the news, was our pentabarb in dog food.
Oh, the pentobarbital in, I believe it was Alpo 2014, somewhere in there.
Yeah, so that one, you know, about it, and we called the owner and the owner's vet and said, we would like to know what's going on. And one of the animals had died. And the owner said, well, the vet has the body. And we said, we would really like a necropsy with tox. And so she said, that's fine. And we called the vet and they said, we already got it to the university. Well, now just imagine, without a network in place, the government is calling a university and saying, we want to tell you what we want you to do, and we want you to report it to us. University types are going to say, nah, you know, but we called their network lab of ours and we said, we would like to, we will pay for it. We would like you to do this, this, and this, and we want to know as soon as possible. And they said, you bet, you know, because they were one of our labs. They knew us. We had the personal relationships. We, you know, we had the funding in place, and it was like a no-brainer. But they said, the only thing we can't do is the tox, because we don't have a tox group at our university. But we send it to this other lab at another university.
Right.
And we said, no problem, we'll pay for the shipping. They're one of our labs too. And we contacted them.
So
and
at this
said,
point, how many labs? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So that, and we got the data ASAP, and we're able to say, yeah, we found pentobarbital in the dog food, and you know, it needs recall, and it was a big deal. So I mentioned antimicrobial resistance as part of the fish world. It's also part of VetLearn's world. In 2015, we were mentioned in the National Action Plan for the CARB, combating antimicrobial resistant bacteria. And we were tasked, along with NOM, to standardize methods of our labs and to provide sequencers and look for AMR genes. And frankly, this is one that had huge
Just to clarify, this was a joint project essentially with USDA FSIS for the NARMS program, NARM. And I had a little introduction to that too, where there were times we were said, okay, we're on this animal at this slaughter facility, we're going to pull these samples, and you put them in special containers and ship them special for
Right.
further testing. So again, this was all part of the antimicrobial research. Mhm.
Right. And the VetLearn one was, we instituted our own NARMS-like project for animals, dogs and cats included. We had the small animals and we had the large animals. And we started, I guess, in 2017, and then the NALM lab started in 2018 and sort of modeled how they were doing it based on what we had done. We got 20 what we called source labs that were collecting samples, and we had each of those 20 labs, 5 of them would then provide samples to a sequencing lab. So we had 4 sequencing labs, and that's increased now to 6. But we provided big time sequencers to those labs, and that has had a huge impact on vet medicine. Not only that, before I left, we also provided 11 labs with mini seqs. So those are, they don't have as high throughput, but they provide the ability to do diagnostic samples. So you don't need 30 samples in order to make it worthwhile to run it. You know, you only need a few samples to run it. So that's one way that we substantially changed vet medicine, by providing equipment that then they also felt committed to, and were providing people and getting the people that, you know, the folks that know the IT and the infrastructure and all that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that was one that, you know, I feel in a small way, we've pushed vet medicine into the 21st century.
Gosh, yeah, that's an incredible collaboration. And really, at the end of the day, isn't that what it all means? That we should be combining resources. And as you said, the fact that you were pulled in on melamine in the very beginning, and given your intensive background with so many aspects, even on the human side of physiology. So again, veterinarians as a whole, we really bring a lot to the table. So what happened then? You said at some point you did retire?
Yes, I've retired. I had planned to retire in around, well, I had a lot of vacation time still. So I planned to retire in April, or semi-retire, sort of take a lot of vacation time, April through July of 2020. And of course, COVID happened. And that sort of screwed things up, because at that point, management said, you know, we could really use the people we have on hand, and we need, you know, consistency. And so I said, okay.
We need to figure out what's happening with pets and COVID. That was huge.
Animals and COVID.
Yeah.
And so we figured, okay, with the VetLearn labs, how can we contribute to the entire effort? At that point, human labs were testing for COVID, but they didn't have enough kits. The initial set of kits was contaminated, so that was a big problem. And then, you know, there were few kits available for human testing. So using human kits for vet samples was absolutely not allowed. And, you know, we would take a second seat to any human effort. So that was number one. Number two, we were also saying we're only going to test animals. And we worked with CDC and NALM and USDA and US Fish and Wildlife and GS on developing what our criteria for testing would be in animals. Because again, PPE was not available, so we didn't want to use up more than that. It was all a matter of resources. You know, you don't want to use anything that's going to be needed for the human side.
Mm-hmm.
So minimal testing of animals when needed. And so those criteria were set up, and that was all conference calls and things like that. But then substantially, what could VetLearn do for this effort? And we normally did things like round robins or inter-laboratory comparison exercises. A proficiency test is everybody has the same kit and everybody runs the test, and they should all get the same answer.
Mm-hmm.
Interlaboratory comparison exercises is everybody's got their own separate test, and somebody sends out uniform samples, And then we look at the data and make sure everybody's getting the same answer. No matter how you were testing it, did you get to the right conclusion?
Right.
That's what those comparison exercises are.
Mhm.
And we had been doing stuff like that. So we said, okay, you all are doing your own, making up your own testing methods for COVID. Because they were doing it from scratch rather than the recipe that CDC had. So they all wanted to test the validity of their tests. And so we said, okay, well, we'll run it. We asked USDA if they wanted to do it, and NVSL was busy working on their own test, and also whatever animal tests came back positive, they had to confirm those. So they were swamped, they were busy. And so we said, okay, well, Vetlearn does this, we will do it. We'll do it for any labs that want to join us. So normally we just do Vetlearn, and sometimes we've collaborated with USDA. We included the folks from the private labs. So the labs that, like, you know, the vet puts the samples outside and the lab picks them up. All the private labs also wanted to participate and test their tests and validate them. So logistically, it was kind of difficult because government had sent everybody home. And the folks that we normally use to actually make up the test kits and things, those are collaborators that we have in Illinois, the Moffitt Center. And they're also the, what do you call it, SIFSANS, Food Safety and Applied Nutrition Labs. So we had to, one, get clearance to get them to come back to the lab. And then we needed the virus, and we wanted to inactivate it, obviously, the live virus growing in the lab. And they had a way that they would inactivate it and use it for SIFSANS.
So getting people back into in person to do work was challenging. Yeah, it was not only PPE, but it was vaccinations hadn't even really come into play. So, I mean, how did they even work?
Yeah, they would, you know, they would pick days that they would, you know, individual people would come in and no more than 2 people in lab. So there were whole protocols that, you know, when we returned, we had one-way hallways, and, you know, you'd have to sort of peek around the corner to make sure that it was a big deal trying to, I guess it was in August we actually had, and the Moffitt Center had to set up their own test first to make sure that they had it so that they could do the dosing correctly. And
Right.
we did several different sample types, some that needed extraction and some that you just ran it so that if the labs could figure out if they had problems with the extraction step, but they were able to run it, the ones without extraction, they would know, oh, we've got to work on this particular aspect of it. So we sent complex samples, and by September, they all had done it. We also worked with a group in Germany that does a lot of statistical analysis on proficiency and comparison exercises. So it was an international collaboration to try to get it all together. Got the report done. The labs did fantastic. It was such an amazing thing that all of these individual tests that they had developed all worked wonderfully.
They all did work. So at that point, you were you essentially working and conducting all this from home?
Yep. Basically, it was, we had planned to have a big lab get together of all of the Vetlearn labs in April, and I was going to announce I'm going to retire, and we had to cancel that because of COVID. And then we all were on by ourselves at home. But Vetlearn works remotely anyway. I mean, normally we have conference calls with folks in California and, you know, all the different labs. There's many, you know, 40 labs. And
luckily you have that in place because Vetlearn already did have that network established, and the collaboration was pretty seamless at that point.
Exactly.
So you
we worked with you know, conference calls all the time.
Dare I say you were probably one of the few that were essentially prepared for COVID or some kind of COVID-like situation. So
exactly.
thank goodness, who would have ever guessed? So I do remember being rather astonished when I was seeing information come out that would say, for example, oh, the there was some zoo animals that were tested and they came back positive. And I thought, gee, this is so early in the process. How did they get that going? Now this is my answer.
Right. Well, so that 2 Veterinary labs actually were involved with that. One was Cornell, and I guess it was the Bronx Zoo had sent over to Cornell, but they also shipped to Illinois because they wanted to duplicate samples and make sure. And it was the lab director at Illinois, actually, when they came up with the positive, drove the samples down to USDA to NBSL himself to make sure that that got confirmed then by NBSL. I mean, so it was many hands working very hard.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it sounds like it. You know, I want to roll this this whole concept over to, again, you know, looking at how this operates in terms of food safety. So now that the VetLearn network has grown so dramatically, what comes to my mind again was looking back at the whole issue of pentobarbital in pet food and how quickly that was determined ultimately. And the recall, I think, was one of the most massive on canned food back in around, I want to say it was around 2017. And at that time, the fact that these laboratories were coming into play and allowing for the testing of pet food. So would you say that that pet food can be analyzed now more effectively by using the VetLearn network?
Well, we actually, we do test foods when it's a case that we are involved in, but it's not, you know, the job of the labs, these are diagnostic labs. So mostly they examine necropsy tissues or urine or blood. I mean, they do the diagnostic tests on the animals in collaboration with the owner and the owner's vet. They're not food testing labs.
Okay.
There are other food testing labs. Now, if the owner comes in with a sample of some food and the diagnostic lab has a tox component to it, they may do some of that testing.
Which I believe Cornell does.
Yeah. And Davis, you know.
Yeah, and so,
Gay.
yeah, because you know, how are they testing for pentobarbital and so forth, which labs and so on? As
Michigan, and I mean, there's a lot of different labs, and different labs have different specialties. For example, Michelle Mustrom, you know, and ergots, and you know, testing hay for ergot type compounds.
Yeah, the ergot, and Texas A&M is very big on testing animal feed for toxins as well.
But often that's not necessarily in the vet diagnostic lab. That might be another chemist group.
Yeah, and more associated with universities. So I think what I'm trying to say for all those who are veterinarians listening to this, take a look at pet food, animal feed, and do understand that there is testing available today. Maybe not specifically within the VetLearn network. As you said, there's certain labs that specialize more in that or have more of that availability. But do understand this, you know, like, you know, when I started almost 40 years ago as a veterinarian, that was never really a thought to test pet food. It was certainly, oh, we'll test animal feed for nutrient levels.
Yeah.
But now let's stop, look at the situation with pet food recalls. And there are some veterinarians who are pretty savvy. They will say, you know what, I am going to talk to the owner about the fact this pet is ill, and we're going to take a look at the pet food. And so veterinarians do ask, what is that pet eating? Now, especially with so many new types of pet foods out there, there are so many that are being developed that we can't even keep up with the numbers of them on the market. And it's
some of them are niche, and some of them are the raw foods.
Yes.
And you know, certainly a lot of those when we've dealt with owners that get sick, or the animals are sick, or both. You know, before VetLearn, FDA could only do passive. They could collect the records from the vet and they could collect the report from the owner, and that was it.
Right.
With VetLearn, we can contact the vet, say, can you run this? Can you do a fecal? Can you do this? You know, or can you get a fecal sample and ship it to our lab to run other tests?
Yeah.
So we actually can do things as opposed to just read about what was done.
Exactly. So really what we're saying is that we've improved light years in the veterinary community in the fact that we can do these testings. I remember several years ago when I was starting to figure out what I wanted to do for my master's in food safety, which I did at Michigan State University. And at that point, it was impossible to find a laboratory that would be willing to test pet food. And that was 2013. Through the years, finally, by the time as I was coming to the end, it was somewhere around 2018. And I was starting to identify laboratories. And now to this day, I do have laboratories I'm signed up with where I can send in pet food samples and get a turnaround within a couple of days.
One of our earliest collaborations with USDA and some of the public health labs with Fern was doing a study of various animal foods, dog foods, that we had tested for Listeria, Salmonella, toxigenic E. coli, and we found Listeria in a number of the feeds. And that was really new too. And before we even published that, we said to management at FDA, you've got to put out a consumer alert. And it was primarily the raw foods where we got the Listeria out of. But, you know, you've got pregnant mom feeding the dog in the kitchen with food that's potentially got Listeria in it, you know.
Yeah.
and they put out a consumer alert quickly because, you know, it was not one of the bugs that people looked for in
Not at all. No, everybody was going crazy looking for Salmonella, but the top three in food safety, just as you said, E. coli, Salmonella, and Listeria. And we all know if Listeria is very difficult to get out of your environment once you already have it in there. And so sanitation is important. I gotta just say that the one thing everyone can do from the get-go is to take their online state's food handlers course. Those are normally just a 15-minute course you go through online. This is useful for everyone, everyone. And this will help keep your kitchen clean for both your pets and your humans.
Absolutely. Yeah, you know, I drive my husband nuts because I label the date I open things in the refrigerator. And if it's leftovers, they get a date put on them too.
Heck, I remember the days when Food Channel first came out, when we were getting all these channels on TV. Oh, then the Food Network, woohoo. And oh my gosh, they were so big into food safety. And they do those nice programs where they go, okay, we're going to test this. This is sitting in your leftovers in your fridge for 7 days. Let's see what bacteria we get. And so, yeah, you know, we all learned a lot of that. But again, you know, it's important, not just on the human side, but on the pet side. Everybody, you know what? Simple. Wash your hands, clean off your counters correctly, and chances are you're good to go. But then at the very most important thing to understand is, again, folks, check with your veterinarian. If your pet is acting sick, bring in your pet food, have that conversation with them about what you're feeding your pet, because that is really important now.
Yes.
Everything can get into the pet food supply chain.
Yep.
So that's why it's important. And then go over as a public health situation affect you as a human. So I understand that we've covered so much, but I have to finish with just one little, well, maybe two questions. One, are you retired yet?
I am. I retired after that report, the report for testing for SARS-CoV-2 was submitted. then, you know, the fiscal year for the government is October, and October 2020, I retired. And my mom was living with me, and she was 97 at the time, and it was really her last 6 months. And so those were a bit difficult. So it was good that I was able to spend the time with her at that point.
Oh, wow. So that was very many years working and contributing to veterinary medicine on so very many levels. And then I like to ask folks, what is something you want to look back on with your whole career? And I know that you did say, hey, folks, it's important to consider joining organized veterinary medicine. The American Association of Food Safety and Public Health Veterinarians is welcoming everyone. If you are in clinical practice, you're in public health, and you're also dealing with pet food safety. So we're the place for you. And so organized veterinary medicine is a big deal. It helps you throughout your career in networking and accomplishing fantastic projects. Looking back, what do you have to add as a final thing you want to just tell all of us?
I guess working as a clinical vet is really fulfilling. And, you know, when you're doing that, it's wonderful. But having said that, it's really amazing the impact you can have if you branch out into other areas. You know, if you look at the interviews that you've had here, you can see I used the word serendipity before. And, you know, serendipity contributes to a lot of careers in academia and in government. You know, and I've been in all of these,
Right.
and each of them is great, and each of them you can contribute a lot. But there's this one saying that I know, and that's chance favors the prepared mind. So if I hadn't had the exposure to the human pathology in the extreme that I had, you know, compared to my vet pathology training, you know, I might not have recognized those crystals and the potential of making spherulites and the mechanism of the toxicity. And so I guess to the students or the folks that are early in their career, learn. Seriously, you know, and from every part of your career, you learn a lot. And some of the things that may not seem totally relevant, you know, for me, I sort of looked at nutrition and food safety during vet school as, yeah, I gotta listen to my milk safety test, you know, or lecture, or, you know, that we had recordings that we would listen to and stuff. And it was like, oh, but I did it and I learned it. And I think that those things that you bring with you later on, you may find that they are useful. So I went from mammalian clinical practice to then focusing on aquatics, and then eventually came back to running a network which focuses more on mammalian medicine again and food safety. And I brought everything to play at the end of my career. I used all of the things that I had learned.
Well, I have a feeling you're just taking a little hiatus and you'll still find ways to contribute. I will put in my pitch for you to contribute to our new website that our association is building right now. It should be ready in July. We are going to have a section for people to contribute blog posts, to contribute white papers, and this would be a fantastic opportunity as well. So I
look forward to reading it at the very least.
reading it, and everybody can learn from, but I can see now I can pick on you for some of that, which would be really quite fun. And I am so excited that we had this opportunity to sit down and talk. And I know we spent so much time, but gosh, every bit of it was fascinating, and it really brings to light how veterinarians can have very varied careers at any point. Don't be afraid to look and see what opportunities are before you, and join us. We're going to have, as I said, our new website will be shooting out soon, hopefully next few weeks. And in the meantime, how can folks reach out to you? What way would they be able to touch bases with you if they wanted to?
you can put my email up there, and I'm happy to chat with them about things. And there's a bunch of articles that they can look up the links on, and again, I'm fine with email.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I will be putting that in the show notes, folks. The show notes will be quite extensive, but they'll be full of these resources for you. So Dr. Renate Reimschuessel, I have to tell you that this has been so awesome. I love that we have the opportunity to segue into the pet food safety arena as well, which is my particular passion. And folks, again, I urge you, please like and share and subscribe to our channel. We're on both podcasts and YouTube. So thanks, everyone, and goodbye for now.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.